I'm Big T, and welcome to Big T Studios. I'm going to throw a question out into the World Wide Web. Are Americans just expected to overpay for everything? Now, I could go on and on about medicine, cars, products from China, defense of other countries at the U.S. taxpayers' expense, but I like focusing on music. Now, trust me, there are plenty of price points and items that we can talk about on this topic. Marshall introduced the Studio series of amps a few years ago, and the Studio series all have the preamps of their vintage counterparts but are set at 20 watts. Unlike other low wattage amps, these amps are not using the EL84 tubes. Players have complained that the 84s do not have the heft, the push, when they're cranked up. So Marshall loaded these with the EL34 or the 5881 power tubes, depending on which amp you get out of the series. Now, I remember watching a YouTuber, Ryan Bruce, also called Fluff by his friends. I've not met him, so Mr. Bruce, Fluff, he stated that these amps were selling for $1,800, and I remember when they come out, they were expensive, crazy expensive. Pre-COVID, most 20 watt amps were selling in the $400 to $1,000 range. What made the studio amps so ridiculously high? Were they just that good? Unlike other low wattage amps, these were made in England rather than Mexico, China, or Vietnam. Since they were made in England, I had to wonder, was the Tolex made from authentic dragon hide, taken from St. George's dragon? Was the internal glue that held the cabinet together, was that made from the ground unicorn hooves? I've retired from gigging, so I don't need a 100 watt or even a 50 watt amp. As I'm setting up my studio for my golden years, I'd like to have some of these reference amps. And what's a reference amp? Well, it's an amp that everyone knows and understands the sound type. Everyone knows Fender Twin for cleans. They have that lush, drippy reverb, and when you hear it, you know it. Vox AC30 has its own cleanish, chimey sound, and they break up kind of crunchy when you really start pushing it. Soldano, the SLO 100, Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, and the PV5150 are basically the reference amps for the high gain crowd. Finally, the Marshall sound is the sound of rock and roll, especially when you look back at the 70s and the 80s. Through the years, Marshall made the amps that the innovators in blues and rock and roll used to make great albums. Take it from the earliest person I can remember is Jimi Hendrix. Of course, people talk about Eric Clapton being before that with the Blues Breaker, and that's where the JTM 45 comes in with Eric Clapton. The JTM 45 was Marshall's take on the Fender Bassman, which were in real high demand in England, but they were extremely scarce. The next big amp to come out of the Marshall factory was the Plexi, and most notably the Super Lead 100. The 1980s saw the introduction of the JCM 800. And towards the end of the 80s, 1987 saw the 25th anniversary Silver Jubilee. And that was a favorite of well-known guitarist Slash. Well, this past spring, I started looking for a Marshall Studio Vintage 20. That was the one I was wanting. It's the 20 watt version of the Plexi Super Lead 100. Now, the Plexi has been one of my holy grail amps ever since childhood. The 3 online stores that I deal with, in no particular order, are Sweetwater, Guitar Center, and Zounds. All 3 of these stores have been out of these Marshall amps since spring of 2024. With the advent of the internet, the world's become a lot smaller place, so I started looking. I found places like Thomann in Germany and Anderton's in England. Both of these stores have had Marshalls in stock the whole time that they've been sold out in the US. But I noticed something even more disturbing when I was looking at these prices. I noticed that these exact same amps were only in the $800 range. I went back to the US websites just to check, because I thought that looked strange, and all 4 of the Studio Series amplifiers had dropped in price to $1,299. Let's just call it $1,300. I mean, what's $1 at $1,200? So all this had dropped in price to the $1,300 range. Even with the $500 drop, Americans are still having to pony up way more than our European counterparts. Why? Is the boat ride from England really that expensive per amp? Well, the boat ride is definitely longer than from England to Germany. But I've noticed something else about these amps. In Europe, each of these amps have a different price. In the US, we're stuck with one price across the board. The ST20, which is the JTM 45 20 watt version, which is Marshall's newest studio offering, is $825 in Europe. We pay $1,300 in the US. The SV20, the Mini Plexi, is $759. We pay $1,300 in the US. The SC20, the Mini JCM 800, is $799. We pay $1,300 in the US. Finally, the Mini Jubilee 2525 is $775 in Europe. We can only get it for $1,300. So who's sticking it to the US consumer? Is the boat ride really $500 per amp? We're going to look at that question here in a minute. Are the US politicians piling on so many import fees from England that it's hurting US musicians? That's not out of the realm of possibility, but as one of our biggest allies in the world, I'm not inclined to think that. Now, I think the previous distributor from Marshall in the US was really sticking it to us. Marshall ended that relationship, and that's when the price dropped by $500. Are the new distributors of Marshall amps in the US still sticking it to the US musician? It's a question you have to ask yourself. Now, I'm going to throw another name into the mix. Electro Harmonics. They've been around since the 70s. Making pedals mostly, but they went to Europe and bought up a bunch of supplies from Russia at a Russian warehouse and made an amplifier called the Softek 50. It's a Bassman. It's a JTM 45. Let's call it just what it is. It's a early Marshall style amp. It's got its own quirks, but it's essentially a 5881 tube series amplifier. It's got the two inputs that you can parallel or jack into both of them if you've got a splitter cable or a pedal that can actually split two signals. Now, Electro-Harmonix makes a tube amp in New York City.
New York City?
Yes, New York City. One of the most expensive cities in the world to run a business or even to live. Electro-Harmonix makes a tube amp that is sold in the United States, 50 watts of power, and only $800. As a comparison, this amp sells for 699 British pounds sterling in England. With the conversion rate in October of 2024, this is just a little over $910 if you convert it to US dollars. So to get an amp from the US to England, tax on $210. That's still a far cry from the $500 add-on that we're stuck with a Marshall amp. Now, when I tried to buy a Marshall amp from either Thomann in Germany, which has US prices, or Anderton's in England, of which I know how to convert pounds to dollars, the website stated that they could not sell a Marshall to someone in the US. So much for free market economy worldwide, huh? I tried to buy a Harley Benton amp, which is Thomann's in-house brand, and the website did not prohibit me from buying it. So that points to the fact that this prohibition may be a manufacturer's contractually stipulated item. They just can't sell to US citizens. If I had to guess, probably Canadians either, but we're in the US here. Now, before anyone throws out the fact that I would have to swap out transformers because I live in the US and the voltage is different, I'd like to say that's not necessarily true. I was stationed in Germany for 3 years, and I bought a Laney ProTube AOR back in 1988. When I came home in 1991, I brought it with me, and I stuck a 110 volt power adapter over the plug and just plugged it into a normal wall jack. The amp took an extra minute or two to warm up and play sounds, a little bit longer than it was in Germany, but the amp sounded great. If I lower the voltage with a Variac controller, why, I'm an innovator. I'm truly inspired. I'm Van Halen. But if I plug the 220 volt plug into a 110 wall socket, I'm just a tightwad who doesn't know what he's doing. Problem is, I've already done this, and it worked just fine for me. So speaking of the Harley Benton amp, this is going to be another part of the problem. This goes back to my argument about the shipping to get an amp on a boat all the way from Europe to America. So Harley Benton amp, the amp that I looked at, was a 25-pound amp, because that's what you're going by. You're going by weight. That 25 amp is 5 pounds heavier than the Marshall Studio Series amp. Thomann from Germany, they're kind of centralized in Germany, is willing to ship that amp to my house, to my door, through the UPS for $65. That's a far cry from $500 per amp. The only thing it changes in getting an amplifier from England to Germany versus England to the US is the length of that boat ride. The factory fills a shipping container. The container gets transported to a port. The container is loaded onto a ship, and the ship travels. The container is offloaded at a port. The container is transported to a distributor. The distributor unloads the container and sends various orders to different music stores. The only thing that changes is the length of the boat ride. Something in this picture is wrong. Is there some moral obligation that anyone living in the United States should pay more for anything? Before you say that England is part of the European Union so they don't have to pay import-export fees, you'd be wrong. England got out of that mess. Remember Brexit? Still, music stores have not had any new Marshall amps in stock for some time as of October 24th, 2024. Stores are projecting that it may be December before they get any new stock. Something to think about is Eddie has already swapped over to the 5150. Slash plays Magnatone, and Metal has gone high gain. Every amp virtual plug-in has some type of Marshall clone. No matter the brand, everybody wants to try to get that sacred Marshall tone. And pedals of all price points have claimed to have some kind of Marshall clone in the sound. And finally, every modeler from the PV Viper or Line 6 at the low end of the price point to the high end at Quad Cortex XFX Kemper promises a Marshall sound alike. Maybe we don't really need Marshall amps all that much anymore. That is a choice only you, the consumer, can make. I say play what you like, enjoy what you play. And if you want to wait for a Marshall and pay extra for it, that's perfectly fine. But you need to put some thought into this. When you're making a decision, you can, in this voting season, I can say vote with your wallet. Choose what you want. We've been out of Marshalls for a long time. People are still making music. Choice is yours. Now be sure to sound off in the comments below. I'm sure I've probably made somebody mad with this. This channel is just getting started. I still have a long way to go. If you could hit the like button for this video and even subscribe to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. I'll be putting out more content as I get rolling. And you know, sometimes I just want to point out things that might be a little bit off the wall and something that you might need to think about. Thanks for stopping in. This has been Big T with Big T Studios.